Okay, our text for tonight is the 19th chapter of Luke. It's a familiar story, the story of a man by the name of Zacchaeus. All right. Luke chapter 19, please. I want to read the story, and then we'll talk about some of the background of the story, and talk about the kind of the label that Zacchaeus had and some of the labels that you and I have today. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and he was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but being a short man, he could not because of the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your home today." So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, "He has gone to be the guest of a sinner." But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Lord, Lord, look, I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because he too is the son of Abraham. The Son of Man came to seek and to save that which was lost." Well, there are a number of different kinds of people that we find in this story. One of the things that I want us to see tonight is which one or which ones, plural, of these people do we happen to be? Which one or which ones do I happen to be? Because we'll find in this, I think, that we are really a conglomeration of a number of different personalities that are described here in this little story. This is a story that the children like because he was a little fellow. We don't know how big Zacchaeus was. We just know he was a short man. And when I was thinking of this sermon, I thought, maybe I ought to go back to this old song, "Short People." I don't know whether you remember that song or not, but there was a song like that, "Short People." And that's what Zacchaeus was. Now let's look at the background of this whole thing. First of all, a description of the city of Jericho. We don't know very much about Jericho ordinarily, that is, the average person, but there's a whole lot of good information about this city. First of all, the city in Jesus' day, the city was rebuilt by Herod the Great. Now, he's the same Herod who was involved in at the time of the birth of Christ, and he had all of the boy babies killed, you remember? Same fellow. He was a great builder. He was a mixed bag for the Jewish people because he spent lavishly on building projects for the people. He built the temple. He built palaces in Jericho. He built the whole city of Jericho, basically. And he designed the city to be kind of a little Rome. A lot of the architecture of the city was Roman architecture, which was designed after the city of Rome. Well, this meant also that the city attracted a lot of very wealthy people. And it was basically it was a very wealthy city, and it was one of the resort cities among the Jewish people. And it was down in the desert, right close to the Dead Sea, and people would go there just to sit in the sun, kind of, like people do with the beaches today. Mark Antony, one of the famous Roman people, Mark Antony had given this city to, guess who? Cleopatra. She owned the city for a period of time there. Well, Herod had built a big palace there, And then when Herod died, he died, by the way, in Jericho. And when he died, he knew people hated him. He had done a lot for the Israelites, but at the same time, he was a ruthless man. There was a saying, and in the Greek, it's kind of catchy. The word for pig is hus. The word for son is huios. And so they had a saying, it's better to be Herod's hus than it is to be Herod's huios, his son. Better to be his pig than to be his son. He had two of his sons killed, executed. He had one of his wives, just all kinds of things like this. Herod was a horrible man. He knew that when he died, everybody would be clapping their hands. And so he had it arranged so that when he was killed, or when he died, that there would be a lot of the Jewish people who were killed, because he says, I want there to be mourning on the day of my death. Wow, yeah. And this is the kind of person he was, but he built the city of Jericho. He was an egotist, if there ever was one, but a great builder. Well, his son, Archelaus, became the king in Herod's place, and he built a big palace there in Jericho too. So Jericho was really quite a place. It was located on the trade route that went north and south, and then moved over toward the Mesopotamia and all. And so it was a commercial city. There was a lot of industry there, but clean industry, you know, and manufacturing of various sorts and so forth. And so that's the kind of a city that it was. It was only about 30 miles from Jerusalem. I remember when I was there, we got in a car or a bus, I don't remember which it was, and you almost literally just, when you leave Jerusalem, you take the car out of gear and you just coast all the way down the hill there to Jericho, because Jerusalem is up on a hill, Jericho is down actually below sea level. But at any rate, that's kind of the background of the city. Well, some other things are important about the background of this lesson, though. Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem. This was going to be his final entry into Jerusalem. It was just after this, a matter of maybe hours or maybe just a couple of days after the events that we're talking about with Zacchaeus, that Jesus made his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. It was about the Passover time, and so there were people coming to Jerusalem, and most of them, or many of them anyway, would come right through Jericho, up the hill to Jerusalem, you see. And so it was natural that there be a big procession, a big following. Now here comes Jesus. He was very popular, and here comes Jesus, and this gathering of pilgrims and the gathering of people and people going to the Passover and all of that, it just formed an ideal situation there, and people were shouting and so forth and carrying on, you know, like a procession will do. And there was a blind man there, and this blind man, his name was Bartimaeus, and this blind man says, what in the world is going on? And somebody says, oh, Jesus of Nazareth is coming. And you get that in the latter part of the 18th chapter. Jesus of Nazareth is coming. He knew who Jesus of Nazareth was, because immediately he shouted out and he said, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. And some in the crowd said, shut up. Quite literally, that's just about what they said. Shut up. Keep quiet. Don't bother him. But he shouted even more loudly, and Jesus stopped and he said, bring that man to me. And they brought him over there, and Jesus said to him, what do you want? What do you want from me? And he said, Lord, I want to see. And so Jesus said, your faith has healed you. And this man opened his eyes and he could see. A great miracle. And that just added to the jubilation of this whole crowd and everything. And then as Jesus goes on, it's too bad that there's a division between the 18th and 19th chapters here, but he goes on into Jericho. And as he goes into Jericho, the scene changes there. The scene changes. There's a man, a little short man, and he wants to see Jesus. And he goes and climbs up that sycamore tree, and because he wanted to see Jesus as Jesus passed by. Well, let's pause for just a minute now. What kind of people were in the crowd, do you suppose? And I emphasize, do you suppose, because we don't really know. But let's stop and think about crowds for a moment. Jesus attracted a lot of crowds. Sometimes he rebuked people in the crowd because they were not honest, they were not sincere. He fed 5,000 and then they followed him for a while. Why? He said, well, you wanted another free meal, that's all. And there's just, things like this would take place. So let's just suppose what kind of people may have been in that crowd. And let's see if this is kind of where any of us might be. Well, crowds that follow leaders like this, sometimes they're just curious people. Whether it's political, economic, religious crowd, whatever it is, some people just come out of curiosity. What's going on? No doubt there were some people like that. It appears that Zacchaeus may have been that kind of person. He wanted to see Jesus. Didn't say anything about his interest in spiritual affairs or anything like that. He wanted to see Jesus. Well, not really interested, just curious. But a big leader, a prestigious man, a popular man, is going to attract curious people. And then there's sometimes people say, oh, Jesus of Nazareth, he's very prominent. People all over Israel know about this fellow. And so there are going to be some important people out here, maybe the mayor of the city, maybe the city council, maybe some of the leaders of the religious groups and so forth. They're probably going to be out here too. So some people just like to go and kind of hobnob around with the mayor or the governor or whoever it might be, who's kind of an important person. I wonder sometime how about Christian people. Why do we gather together? Now this is a small crowd, and we're here for a purpose. But so much of the time, religious movements attract a lot of people who like to be with important folks. And it may very well be that was some of these people. And then probably there were some of the religious leaders of the day. This is an interesting thing. The religious leaders never did really catch on to Jesus. They didn't understand him. And in many cases, and no doubt this had something to do with the crucifixion, in many cases, they felt like their jobs were threatened. Their positions were threatened. As a matter of fact, there are a few little tidbits there, particularly in John, where we get that idea very, very clearly that some of the religious leaders thought that this man is a threat to us. When John the Baptist came along, the Pharisees and Sadducees came out to his baptism and what's going on here? Who are you? And John says, well, I'm the voice of one crying in the wilderness. Well, John was very outspoken, and John finally was beheaded by Herod. Different Herod, by the way, than the one that I spoke of a moment ago. But this was the way things unfolded. Now let's take a look at Zacchaeus for a moment. We're going to get into Zacchaeus and the religious leaders in just a moment. What kind of a man was Zacchaeus? We don't know. We don't know anything about him, except that he was a wealthy man, and that he was a chief publican or a chief tax collector. Now, the way the Roman government did, because the way they collected their taxes, and they had a lot of different taxes. They had property taxes, poll taxes, commercial taxes, transportation taxes. They had all kinds of taxes. Now, what they did, they found someone within the province, and they would divide the province up into sections, and a man would buy the right to collect taxes within that section. Now, there were some who were very honest. There were some who were very corrupt. We don't know exactly where Zacchaeus fit in reference to this. But when they collected the taxes, they could take a portion for themselves. And then they were responsible for paying Rome a basic certain amount. Well, you can see the way that was open to all kinds of corruption. And so the tax collectors were hated. They would then, the chief tax collector would farm things out to individual publicans, individual tax collectors. They would do the dirty work of collecting the money, turn it over to him, and then he would send a portion of that back to Rome. Well, the corruption among these people was rampant. Now, the thing was that the tax collectors were Jews. They were not Romans, they were Jews. And so the Jewish people looked at these tax collectors, they were called publicans. They looked at these tax collectors as the scum of the world, the scum of the earth, because they are traitors to our country. They are collecting money from us and sending it to pagan Rome. And they're cheating us, and they're filling their own pockets. And it mentioned that this fellow was wealthy. And so he probably had a bad reputation among a lot of the people because he was wealthy. Well, as a chief tax collector, he had opportunity, and he may have taken advantage of the opportunity. He had opportunity to cheat people, opportunity to make a lot of money, and since it mentions that he was wealthy, that probably means that he had done some of this. We don't really know that for a fact. Now, let's branch off for just a moment. He had a label. All of us have labels. They're called epitaphs sometimes. That's just a nice name for label, that's all. The tax collectors were sinners. That was their label. Then there were other people who had labels. I've got a list of some that I just thought of through the Bible, you know. You remember the story of Naaman in the Old Testament? He had leprosy. He's referred to as Naaman the leper. That was his label. Lazarus the beggar. Bartimaeus the blind man. Peter the fisherman. Later became, his label changed. He later became Peter the apostle. Paul, the persecutor of the church, Saul of Tarsus. His label also was changed to Paul the apostle and the servant of Jesus Christ. That brings up the question of what kind of a label do I have? All of us have labels. I may be Jack Burch the bum. That may be my label. Parents give labels to children unknowingly a lot of times. As the child is growing up, this child is told, you're dumb, you can't learn. You're not as smart as the rest of the kids in the class. And so in his mind, this child has the label that says, Johnny the dumbbell. And that's the way he grows up. And that's the way he feels about himself. And then sometimes other people will give individuals a label. Let me tell you a true story. I have a very close friend. When he was about a year old, he had polio. It left him very, very crippled, very crippled. One of his legs has a brace from the hip down to the foot. His left arm is only about that long. He has no movement for that left arm. And some very incompassionate person said to him one time, why don't you just have the thing amputated? It's not doing you any good. And I thought that was a terrible thing to say, but his reply was, no, that's part of me. He was not embarrassed about it. He wasn't ashamed of it. He could have been called Tim the handicapped, Tim the paralytic. He had one leg that worked pretty well, and he was on a crutch. This man had a tremendous voice. He had a baritone solo type voice. I've heard him sing so many times, and in the chorus that I used to sing in, he was singing also. And in that chorus, he was the baritone soloist for a chorus of about 125 people. And he was amazing. He just had this roaring bass baritone voice. He told me one time, he said, Jack, if I hadn't had this disability, I probably would have gone into a musical career. And he could have done it. He had that kind of voice. Tim the paralytic, Tim the handicapped, Tim the cripple. No, Tim's mom and dad would not allow him to be called that. They forced him to become what he was. I say forced, not in an ugly sense. They simply would not allow him to use his handicap as an excuse for inferior work. And today, instead of Tim the handicapped, he is Tim the intense Bible student, Tim the servant of God, Tim the gospel minister. He has spent his life as a minister. It's really interesting to be with him. He and I are very good friends. He used to preach at the Camarillo. He preached for the Camarillo Church for 24 years. And he established himself, not just there, but elsewhere as well. He established himself as a man who was the servant of God. He joked about his disability. He was at a restaurant. This became just a funny thing with us. He was in a restaurant one time. I was not with him. He told me about it. And he always had his crutch close by. And there was a lady in the restaurant sitting very close to him who told the waiter something. And the waiter came over and said, sir, would you mind if we put your crutch out of sight? It's offensive to this woman over here. She actually said that. And this became a joke with us. We would go out, Tim and I would go out to eat, and I would say, Tim, would you mind putting your crutch over there? It's offensive to me. Well, the thing was that Tim Kelly was able to overcome a label that could very well have been stuck on him. Now, Zacchaeus was like that. Zacchaeus had a label. What was the label? He is the sinner. Because when Jesus went into his house, what did they say? Oh, he's going into the home of a sinner. You don't do that, do you? You don't associate with sinners. Jesus did. And so the label that Zacchaeus had was, I'm a sinner. And he may very well have been a very big cheat. We don't know. Now, Jesus went in and visited this man. And as a result of Jesus coming to this man, he said, Lord, listen to me, Lord. I give half of my goods to feed the poor. If I've cheated anybody, I repay 4 times. Some people have said, well, that's what he's been doing all his life. No, I don't think so. I think this was something he is about to begin to do. Why? Because Jesus said, today salvation has come to this house. And so it seems that Zacchaeus now, because of his brief association with Christ, that was really a deep, important relationship that developed here. Because of this, Zacchaeus was a changed man. There's an old poem. We don't know who wrote this. But it's a poem that says something about how Christ can touch the heart of anyone who will allow him to do so. "'Twas battered and scarred, and the auctioneer thought it scarcely worth his while to waste much time with an old violin, but he held it up with a smile. "'What am I bidding, good folks?' he said. "'Who'll start the bidding for me? $1, then $2, $2. Who'll make it $3? $3 once, $3 twice. Going for $3, but no." From the room far back, an old gray-haired man came forward, and he picked up the bow. Then, wiping the dust from the old violin and tightening the loose strings, he played a melody pure and sweet as the caroling angels sing. The music ceased, and an auctioneer with a voice that was quiet and low, he said, "What am I bid for this old violin?" And he held it up with the bow. $1,000. Who'll make it $2? $2,000. Who'll make it $3? $3,000 once, $3,000 twice, and going and gone, said he. The people cheered, but some of them cried, "We do not quite understand what changed its worth." And swiftly came the reply, the touch of the Master's hand. Many a man with a life out of tune, who is battered and scarred with sin, is auctioned cheap to the thoughtless crowd, much like the old violin. A mess of pottage, a glass of wine, a game, he travels on. He's going once, he's going twice. He's almost gone. But the Master comes, and the foolish crowd never quite understands the worth of a soul and the change that is wrought by the touch of the Master's hand. You see, Christ can change so much in our lives. Christ can make such a difference. Zacchaeus, and the title of my sermon, The Little Man Who Did Big Things. Zacchaeus gives us the example of a man who is a cheat, a man who is corrupt, a man who is reputed as a sinner. And because of a brief contact with the Lord, his whole life was changed. I heard a man say one time that he said, "I was raised in the Church of Christ, and I was faithful, and then I lost interest and I fell away. And I did some terrible, terrible things. And I just lived a very bad life. And then I finally came to my senses and I came back to Christ." And he said, my life has turned 180 degrees. And now he's a faithful Christian. You see, the world doesn't understand this. The average person doesn't see how Christianity works. in people's lives sometimes. Instead, they see a set of rules and regulations. They see a set of commands. Do this, don't do that. And that's about all they see. And folks, maybe they need to see in us not just the set commands that we obey, not just the things that we do because we're obligated to do, but maybe they need to see the change from one kind of life into another with a sense of gratitude and a sense of relationship to God, like Zacchaeus. And then no matter how little of stature or how little of reputation we might be, those things are not what make a difference. What makes a difference is the touch of the Master's hand. God wants to touch our lives. Christ wants to guide our lives. We can be superficial in it, or we can be honest and sincere in it. And that's what he's driving at. And so Zacchaeus was a man just like that. I want to tell one more story. It's a true story. And then we'll be through. When I was living in New Orleans, there was a missionary who came. He had spent 20-some years in Africa. And his name was Dow Merritt. Dow Merritt was an elderly man by this time. And in the class that he was teaching and the preaching and so forth, he told this story. He said there was a man by the name of Bodius. And I want you to remember that name. I'm going to come back to him. A man by the name of Bodius, who was a good man, a compassionate man, a wonderful Christian man, very patient man. And he was really a stalwart individual in church. There was another man who lived in the village who was a drunk, a drug addict, an evil man in every way that you can possibly imagine. He was so obnoxious that Dow Merritt said, I can't hardly stand to be in the presence of this man because he is such a terribly evil individual. Well, sometime later, this evil individual showed up with Dow Merritt. Something had changed. He was compassionate. He had become a Christian. He was kind and considerate. And he was a totally different person. And Dow could not understand this. He said, what in the world happened to you? You have changed so much. And he had just one statement to make. He said, I met Bodius. And Bodius, in his life, changed me. Folks, that's the idea of little people doing wonderfully great things. Zacchaeus was a little man whose name went down in history, not because he was prominent or preeminent, not because he was wealthy, but because when he saw Christ and Christ entered into his life, he became a totally changed man. The touch of the Master's hand. Let's conclude with prayer, please. Holy God, our Father, help us to be the kind of people you want us to be. Help us, Father, to see the needs that we have for your forgiveness and for your compassion and your mercy, that we too may be able to offer to the world and to the people that we are closest to the kind of compassion and mercy that you have offered us. Bless us, Lord, to that end. Through Christ we pray. Amen.